Today's episode of SBJ I Factor is sponsored by Pepsi.
This is John Aran, media reporter with Sports Business Journal. Coming up next is my interview with Alison Overholt, who recently started a new job working for Oprah Winfrey and Hearst magazines. She's going to be launching a new lifestyle brand with the company in the coming weeks. I caught up with Alison during her final week at ESPN. We spoke about her journey to become a respected editorial executive in the business. I think you'll like this interview. Alison, you're in the I Factor. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This is fantastic.
Well, I wanted to interview you because you were a member of SBJ's 2015 class of Game Changers. I was the one who handled your write-up. And at the time, you were the editor-in-chief of ESPNW. And you are, from the time we're doing this interview, for the next 48 hours, the senior vice president of multi-platform storytelling and journalism at ESPN.
That's right.
But last week, you announced that you are moving over to work for Oprah. You're going to be the general manager of a multi-platform lifestyle brand published by Oprah Winfrey and Hearst magazines. So thank you very much for joining the I Factor with me today, Alison. And I got to ask you, I know that you have interviewed and talked to and been with a lot of celebrities and a lot of big names from your career. But Oprah, that's a one-word celebrity. What was that like when you went into your first interview and she's sitting across the table from you?
Well, the strange thing is that, in this pandemic world we're all living in, everything's on Zoom. So it was hopping onto a Zoom with Oprah Winfrey. And I was exactly as intimidated and as in awe as you described and would imagine. But I think one of the really interesting things both about her and also about the time that we're living in is that, she's one of these people who is exactly the person when you speak with her and meet with her that you see in all these incredible spaces. She has that authenticity and that very direct way of speaking. There's a sense of gravitas and thoughtfulness, and you really just feel like you're sitting in a chair across from her having a real conversation. So there's something about these Zoom conversations where sometimes they can be almost more distancing because it's this oddity of having a screen in between you and the other person. But one of the things I've noticed just in working with my teams at ESPN in this year since we've all started changing the way we work is that there's also been a great equalizing effect. We are all little boxes in the screen, and we are all just who we are in this little space. And that means that, everybody's voice is, equal to everybody else's voice. And, you're just two people having a conversation. So I know it sounds a little bit trite and cliche, but that's kind of what it felt like. It was, wow, this is this person that I've, admired from afar and obviously followed her career and looked up to for, my entire adult life. And sitting down and talking with her is exactly what I might have imagined it would be.
That's great. The whole point of the I Factor is really to get you to talk about your personal and professional journey. Like, tell me a little bit about your youth. Where did you grow up? What was that like?
Well, I don't know how many people know this about me, but so I was born in the suburbs in New York in Westchester. Lived there until I was almost 9 years old. And then my dad, who ran a research department for an investment bank in the city, was transferred to Hong Kong. So we got posted to Hong Kong for what I thought was going to be about a 3-year stint. And, I was going into 4th grade. So I remember we packed up our house and we had, 2 piles in our house, the stuff we were going to bring with us to Hong Kong and the stuff we were going to put in storage for when we came back. And I'll tell you, 9-year-old me planning for what I was going to need in 7th grade when I came home to Westchester County, we never actually came back. So all that stuff was in storage for over a decade. I actually, I was in Hong Kong from 4th grade through high school. I went to an international school there, which was based on an American curriculum. And eventually at the very end of college is when I broke into those boxes and seeing, a time capsule of what a 3rd grader thought that a middle schooler might need it was just high comedy.
What was in that time capsule?
I mean, there were toys. I don't know why I thought I needed to put some of my toys away and bring some of them with me. There were books that my sister, who was 6 years older, had given me that I didn't think I was ready for yet. And so I tucked them away for when I was, in 6th or 7th grade. There was literal garbage in there. I mean, I opened a box and I was like, oh, because the third grader doesn't actually want to clean stuff up. They just put it in the moving box. So like actual literal garbage had been in storage somewhere in New York State for like 12 years. It's a strange thing when you ask a little kid to pack up their life. It was a totally different culture, totally different community. And when you think about, how you're raising a kid here in the States and the things that you're doing every day, and, just picking that up and kind of plugging it into an entirely new society, I think it set the stage for a lot of who I am now, learning to become adaptable, flexible, curious, all these things that come from just being transplanted and have to find your way, what's the phrase, bloom where you're planted.
Was the third grade you a sports fan?
So that's a really interesting question, because it is something that I contended with for the first time when I actually joined ESPN. Because prior to joining ESPN, I would have said yes. And that's because I was an active sports participant. I was an athlete. I played every sport when I was a little kid. I genuinely thought I was going to go to the Olympics in gymnastics. Somebody had to inform me somewhere around 6th grade, when I was already 5'6", that probably that wasn't my sport. But I did gymnastics, I rode horses, I played soccer, you name it, I was into it. And then we moved to Hong Kong, and, they didn't have girls soccer, only boys soccer. They had gymnastics. It was super competitive. They didn't have horseback riding except in this one location, and it was retired racehorses that you were riding. So let me tell you, that's a really, really different thing than, like trying to learn dressage in Westchester County. I ended up still playing a ton of sports, but it was an evolving thing, and I was finding my way in new areas. I mean, I sort of fell into playing basketball, which became my sport. And it was literally because I went with my best friend in, I think it was 7th or 8th grade. My best friend in the world was nervous to go to tryouts. And so I went with her just to give her some moral support. And by then I was getting really tall. I mean, I was almost 5'10" by the time I was, a 9th grader. So I remember the coach just pointing to me. I was lurking in the back of the gym, just kind of cheering on my friend. And I was wearing Keds. I mean, I literally didn't even have basketball shoes, nothing. And, he just pointed at me and said, I want the big one. And that's how I ended up playing basketball. I didn't know the rules our first game, just nothing. But once I started playing, like, that was my sport. It just, the physicality of it, the strategy of it, the camaraderie of the team, which was very different from, what I'd gotten used to doing gymnastics, everything just thrilled me. And so then when I would, we did what we called home leave every summer. So when you're an expat and you're posted overseas, your company pays for you to go home, a couple times a year. So I would get on a plane and I would come back to the States. And instead of going back to New York, I would actually go to basketball camp. And the basketball camp I went to every summer was Doug Bruno's basketball camp in Illinois. So now, being at ESPN and with all these many years of covering sports, I have such a great appreciation for who Doug Bruno is and what he's meant to women's basketball. At the time, I was this 12-year-old kid who Doug Bruno would pick up at Chicago O'Hare every summer. I was the little kid from Hong Kong, and he'd pick me up, and we, somebody from his staff would pick me up, and we'd drive to the dorms in Lisle, Illinois, and I would go to camp. And toggling back and forth between that kind of coaching world and kind of the American system, and who I was here in the United States, and then who I was when I would go back to Hong Kong, was another very formative experience. Because, I played center in Hong Kong. International rules, there's no different size basketballs. We were playing with a men's ball from, 6th grade onwards. I was a certain kind of leader. It was a very sort of scrappy run and gun playground game. Our conference games were played on concrete courts. We wore knee pads because if you fell, you didn't want bloody knees. So we looked more like volleyball players than basketball players. And then I would come to Doug Bruno's camp, and I was little. And, I went to a post players camp one summer, and I was up to the shoulder of most of the girls at that camp. And I remember one of the coaches pulling me aside and saying, when you're small, you have to be fast. You have to be the fastest. And, you have to become a ball handler. And when I was at home in Hong Kong, they just threw me the ball and I turned and just popped it up for an easy shot. I never was expected to be fast. I wasn't expected to be nimble. No one thought I would be a ball handler. So to come to the US and, essentially be told, adapt yourself, become valuable in a different way. You can be fast, you can be scrappy. And then when you go home, you will be all of the things. So, I mean, that was a really, really interesting thing to learn at that age.
So did you know at that time that you wanted to work in sports?
No, not even an inkling. Mostly because of how different the culture was and how sheltered I was from the idea that sports could be a career. So, put yourself in my shoes at that time. I grew up and my mother was from the Philippines originally. My dad had grown up outside Boston. He was, running a research department that did political risk analysis for an investment bank. All of the conversation in my house was around international politics, economic risk, geopolitical stuff. I mean, this is what I grew up thinking. The only magazines we subscribed to were The Economist, the Far Eastern Economic Review, and Foreign Policy magazine. So back to your question about, was I a sports fan? I sure thought of myself as a sports fan, because I played all the time and I lived and breathed, sports and athletics. But there wasn't a lot of opportunity to watch it on TV. There were the tennis majors that sometimes they would show on TV, but there were only 2 English language channels broadcasting in Hong Kong at the time. They broadcast from 4 p.m. until 10 o'clock at night, and that was it. And we had a hodgepodge of, random American TV shows that were 10 years out of date. A couple of things from, Britain or Australia. Very little sports. What we did have was the NBA game of the week, if you can believe it. And they broadcast it usually Saturday mornings. It was like 10 in the morning, 11 in the morning. So by the time I was in high school, this was the heyday of the Chicago Bulls. Michael Jordan was an international superstar. So pretty much the NBA game of the week every single week was a Jordan Bulls game. I just actually had no awareness of other teams. We just cared about how Michael Jordan was doing. So Saturday was also the day we would play our conference games for our basketball team. So usually I would have my team come over to my house and we would watch, the pregame show with Ahmad Rashad and, watch Michael Jordan on his NBA game of the week. And if he had a good game, we were all psyched when we went to play ours. And if he had a bad game, we'd all be depressed and think, the world was ending. But that was the sum total of my sports spectator fandom. And it wasn't until I came back to the States and began to see like what the whole wide world of sports fandom could be that I even had an inkling of what was out there. And I certainly never imagined that it was a career. I spent hours and hours and hours in the gym, but I got to college and I had intended to play in college. And my very, very, very first week at school, I was exposed to all these other things. I went to Harvard and I began to see, you write for the paper and there's this storied list of alumni who have careers in the business. You go to the Institute of Politics and it's alum after alum after alum who's in government or making policy, and they're all coming back to talk to us. And then I looked at sports, and as much as I loved it, I was like, this is the one thing that we're not really known for. And I'm going to spend 5 hours in the gym every day, and I'm not going to get a job at the end of it because girls don't get jobs playing basketball. So for me, it was like this, it was like the world opened up and it closed at the same time. And the crazy thing for me is that during the summer between my junior and senior year of college is when the WNBA launched. And 3 of my girlfriends from high school who had been teammates of mine, we all got together in LA for my birthday. We bought tickets to an LA Sparks game. And we watched, and we all bought the original t-shirts that said, "See how the other half plays." And we were so proud. And for the first time, I thought, if this had been here when I was making that choice freshman week, it's not that I ever was good enough to play at that level. I mean, I was barely good enough maybe to play in college, but it's more that as long as the possibility exists, you stay in the game. You know, you see what something might be and you stay with it a little longer, and you maybe see that there are all these roles that could have existed around the game. So for me, that was also very informative for when I got to ESPNW, because, you know, it became very important to me, given that I had never grown up seeing, you know, female athletes written about. You know, I never really saw, you know, women on, you know, on TV unless it was the Olympics. You know, I was obsessed with Mary Lou Retton, just like everybody else. You know, if you don't see it, you can't even imagine that there might be a path there. And it became very, very important to me to change that for the next generation.
You know what I love about your story is when you rattled off a list of the publications, the magazines that were in your house, which I think most people that end up going into journalism can do. I mean, was that an option for you? Once you got to school, like how did you decide what your career path was going to be?
Well, so I really was very journalism focused. You know, from early on, I was, you know, I was the editor in chief of my high school newspaper. So it's sort of hilarious. I've got yearbook pictures of me. I was in choir, I did newspaper, and I played basketball. And so my yearbook pictures are hilarious because the picture of, you know, the choir is everybody on risers and looking like a choir would look. And I'm standing there in high tops and a sweatshirt because I had run up from the gym to like stand there for 2 seconds, take the picture and go back to practice. And then there are pictures of me in my basketball uniform laying on the floor, cutting out, you know, layouts, you know, for the newspaper, because I would come from games and just, you know, immediately start working on the paper. So I think journalism was always something that I imagined I might want to go into. It was just, what did I think that looked like? I'll tell you, when I got to college and realized that, you know, writing for the Crimson, I wrote for the Harvard International Review, which was a magazine. You know, I thought that was my path forward, but I always sort of imagined that I might be a foreign correspondent and, you know, end up back overseas. I really never thought I was going to stay in the US. You know, I reached the end of college, and to be honest, I think I just froze, because up until then there were these very defined paths of how you got from one stage of your life to the next. You know, being an athlete, I was very goal oriented. I would decide what I wanted to do, write down what I needed to do to get there, you know, hammer at it every single day, track my progress. And suddenly at the end of college, it was the whole world is open to you. And yet here are some very defined paths that it seems like everybody you go to school with is following. So, you know, people took more tests to go to med school or law school. You know, consulting firms came to campus to recruit. And again, it was something you could study for. There was a certain kind of interview case study that you did, and you could practice and get really good at it and get these fancy jobs that paid you a ton of money. Same thing with investment banking. And then there was also this whole crazy internet thing that was starting. And, you know, it felt like the really wild people took a flyer on Silicon Valley and, you know, trying to change the world with the internet. So, you know, I was very nervous about making my own way in the world. You know, I looked at my friends who were going into journalism, and they were moving to very small towns to take jobs at local papers, making very little money and just having to figure it out. Or I knew people who were moving to New York for unpaid internships at big brands. And then, you know, their parents were co-signing for apartments or letting them move home. And I didn't have that option. My parents said, we sent you to college, we prepared you. The whole point is that now you're good. Go figure it out. And they were both still overseas. So, you know, no one was going to pay my bills. Nobody was going to, you know, make it easier for me to get settled. I didn't even learn how to drive until I was in college, because in Hong Kong, you take public transportation and you have to be 18 to get a license. And I wasn't until I came back. So the idea of, say, moving to Kansas City, trying to get a job at a paper, having to own a car, I mean, that was scarier to me than the idea of moving to another country and starting over. So I had this weird in between time where, you know, I thought, well, I like researching and writing, and that's what I love from journalism, but I don't know if I can pay the bills, and what if it doesn't work? So I kind of split the difference, and I got jobs at think tanks and consulting firms because I thought, well, I can still do the activities I like, but it'll be a little more secure. So that's actually what I did out of college. And it was a good thing to do something that you really don't like, because you learn really, really fast that if you do something that isn't who you are, you'll be miserable. So, I gained a lot of skills. I became very good at PowerPoint. I became an Excel master. I worked on presentations, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, I knew that I wanted to be telling stories. And it was a very, very good way to learn fast who I actually was and what I wanted to be.
I want to start talking about your professional life a little bit now. In terms of your management style, like what are some of the leadership lessons that you learned when you first started managing others? And as a reporter, I know managing reporters is not the easiest thing in the world to do.
Yes. Management things. Well, one of the interesting things as somebody who comes up as a reporter and a journalist, and you know this very well yourself, is that the things that make you good at reporting and writing are not necessarily the things you need to be good at to manage other people. And I've talked often with the people, in my world about the oddity of our industry, that when you're a really great reporter, they make you an editor. And when you're a really great editor, they make you a management person. And literally very few of those things prepare you for what you're going to do next, or necessarily are the qualities and skills that you need for that next step. So for me, a lot of learning those things came from watching other people that I admired and trying to learn very, very fast. I feel terrible for the people that I managed early on, because I don't really think I had a lot of skills in that area, and I was kind of making it up as I went along. Some of the things that did translate from the practice of journalism is the importance of listening. There are a lot of folks in management structures who enjoy commanding the room, maybe at the expense of listening to what the people in the room have to say. So, growing up as a reporter and fine tuning that sense of, there's a story here in this room. And if I listen carefully and then ask the right questions and then get people in the right circumstance, they will share that with me. And then the next step as a leader or as a manager is, well, how do you craft your response to what you learn? How do you apply that to making the work experiences of the folks on your team better? So I think, listening, asking smart questions, reading a room, being inclusive so that you are open to hearing ideas and feedback from folks at all levels and in all roles. These are things that, became real principles for me as I ended up moving forward in management.
Alison, you referenced a couple of people that you kind of took notes from in terms of managers. Who are your mentors in terms of that?
That's a great question. I mean, my very first boss in the business. So I started in finance and technology writing. I was at Fast Company magazine. George Anders, who was a legendary Wall Street Journal reporter, was our bureau chief out in Silicon Valley. So he was my very first boss in the business. He was somebody who he was very thoughtful and careful in the way that he offered feedback. So that idea of listening and then absorbing and then taking a beat to think about how you offer feedback is something that I learned from watching George. When I first started, he actually asked if he could listen to the recordings of my interviews. And then he would offer me feedback in how to improve my interview style. That's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to do and make sure you're going to connect with the person so they take your feedback. But it showed me that as a manager and as a bureau chief, he was invested enough in my success that he was taking the time to actually, sit through these, hours of tape and then offer very clear and specific feedback. So, he was number one in my business. The person who hired me initially at ESPN the magazine is Gary Belsky. And what I learned from him was to be open to learning things from the people on my team. And, Gary has this huge personality. He was very blustery. He would like needle people. He would kind of walk through the office and be, tossing comments here and there. And he always seemed to know the thing that was going to tweak somebody, and he didn't really hesitate to do it. But by doing that, he always pushed us really hard at exactly the moment that you needed to be pushed. And then, we actually had a couple of moments where we really clashed, like early on, our personalities were just so different. ESPN and sports was this big blustery environment. And, I was a pretty intense cerebral person. I'd be in editorial meetings and some of the editors would look at me and they'd be like, Overholt, why are you so earnest all the time? And I didn't know how to handle it. And Gary was interesting because, I remember a couple of these times where we were really butting heads. And later on, he would circle back with me and tell me what he thought he had learned from our interaction and how that was going to change the way he managed moving forward. And the idea to me that a leader and a manager was not any weaker for having admitted that they could learn something from someone else and change moving forward. Like it actually made me trust his judgment more. And I thought he was a stronger leader for that. So I always carried that with me as well. John Kozner was the person who made me editor-in-chief of ESPN, the magazine, when I returned to ESPN. The thing that he always shared was the importance of being able to clarify priorities and mission, and then to reiterate it. So that's another thing that coming from content was a very, very difficult thing for me. And I think I'm still like relearning that lesson over and over again. When you're a writer, the cardinal sin is to repeat your language. You don't want to use the same words over and over again in a column. If you use a special turn of phrase, you don't want to repeat it over and over. That's bad, right? But as a leader, John would always emphasize people can't take new direction and then immediately act on it and remember it and follow it through. You need to reinforce. You need to make sure you're stating things with a clarity that it can be reinforced over and over and over again so that people understand what our mission and priority is and can carry that forward. So that's something that I think about deeply. And then Laura Gentili, I leave her to the end because, she's such a formative person in my career and, specifically in my time at ESPN. And it's because she had the vision and the passion to bring to life that thing I was talking about earlier, all of what I didn't grow up with. Laura not only said, this is missing and we should do this, but, she approached researching the market opportunity with a meticulousness that other people who had gone before had not done. She had the passion to just keep knocking down obstacles every time she encountered them. And then, she took a shot on those of us around her who wanted to join in that mission. And then she just kept pushing us every time somebody wanted to, slow down or say, why don't we make the mission a little smaller because it would be easier? She'd say, no, keep going, keep going, keep going. So, those are some of the folks that I think I carry with me every single day.
This is always one of my favorite questions, but what's your best failure?
Oh, my best failure. Gosh, I'm sure there are a lot of them, but I will share one from my very first year back at ESPNW. And we wanted to offer up an ESPNW take on fantasy sports because fantasy was such, a big part of the ESPN culture. We knew a lot of women were interested in fantasy sports, and we wanted to have a W specific take on it. And, we put together what felt like a really, really fun content offering, and it fell completely flat. And not only flat, it like lit up the blogosphere with, this is what ESPN thinks women need to understand fantasy. And ESPNW is sexist. And this is more evidence that ESPN, doesn't understand or care about women. I've never been so shocked at the reaction to something and so devastated because we had actually, it was a bunch of women in a room coming up with this, thinking it was hilarious and fun, and it was taken so poorly. And so what I learned from that was it's not just about the thing itself. It's not just about the content and the quality of the thing in a vacuum. You have to understand the context around it and how it will be perceived through the lenses that already exist. I was coming back to ESPN after having been out in the world for several years, and I had worked, on, different projects at different women's brands. And I kept saying to people, if Cosmo had done this, everybody would think it was irreverent and hilarious and like a fun satirical twist, and they're owning it. And I had to learn the hard way in that moment that, well, we weren't Cosmo. And we weren't a brand that was established with women, with built-in credibility. In fact, we were always going to be refracted through the lens of what the public thought ESPN, big mothership ESPN, was trying to say about women. So we were never going to be considered purely on our own merits. And so understanding that push-pull of public perception, lenses that people bring, through their own experience to a circumstance, and how that interacts with the reality of the thing you've made. I mean, that was difficult and important, and very, very valuable.
Alison, I want to end with a couple of quick hitting questions.
Sure.
What are you binging now?
Everything. Let's see, I watched Bridgerton twice. I finally caught up on Riverdale. I've finally convinced my husband to watch The West Wing. So we are rewatching everything from the very beginning, which is hilarious and amazing. Let's see what else. I've rewatched The Good Place twice. I've discovered that all of those old fun procedurals from the USA Network way back when that's what they did are all on Amazon now. So I'm watching, In Plain Sight, and it's a lot. I binge stuff all the time.
You're a heavy media consumer. Are you reading? What are you reading right now?
I am reading, I don't know if you're a science fiction or a fantasy person, but I am reading this right now. There's a book called Red Rising by Pierce Brown, and it's a fantasy sci-fi set in Mars, political drama, futuristic thing. It was one of the best books I had ever read years ago. And somehow I blew through the trilogy and didn't realize that there was the start of a new trilogy based on the same universe. So I'm in this one right now.
The sports industry needs to do a better job of
including all voices and recognizing that we are all sports fans.
What's the best career advice that you've received?
Be who you are. Don't sand your rough edges or try to fit in a box because you think that that's what your profession needs. You are enough, and be who you are every single day.
Well, Alison, I'm going to miss interviewing you at ESPN. Good luck over at Oprah, and thank you for joining the SBJ I Factor.
Thank you so much, John. It's been such a pleasure.
Thanks for joining SBJ I Factor today. Remember to subscribe to SBJ I Factor wherever you listen to your podcasts, and listen to our future episodes that will hit every 2 weeks.